As I got into this lawsuit, I began to find that there was a pattern at the top, and I now know why the bankers have been given immunity. It's because they're all involved with elite paedophile rings.
Hey friends, thanks so much for tuning in. It's Sean from SGTreport here with a very compelling interview with Mark Anthony Taylor. This is very much a David versus Goliath story. Mark is taking on the big international criminal banks for their precious metals manipulation because he's been victimized, as so many of us have. And we're going to talk in this interview also about the pedophilia rings, because this global mafia is victimizing not only humanity through the monetary system, but also children through the trafficking systems. If you've been victimized because you bought silver at much higher prices and they manipulated those prices back down to 20 and now 14 or 15, Mark Anthony Taylor is your man, because he won't go gentle into that good night. He's fighting these guys and taking them on, and I want to talk to him about it. He comes to us from the UK right now. Mark, how are you?
I'm great. I'm energized. I'm very angry in a very good, positive way.
Well, you know, righteous indignation is quite understandable for those of us that have been victimized. I think the best single example of that right now is Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, who has every right to be righteously angry over his maltreatment, his mistreatment by the Me Too movement and the Democrats. And you, sir, probably have the right to feel that way too. Give us background about you and your situation.
Okay, I'm a trained theoretical physicist. And I quit my job and I became a computer programmer, and I basically went off the rails in 2001, which is the dot-com crash. But I rebuilt my life, and I got a job in Germany at a computer games company called Crytek. And I lived very modestly, as if I was on welfare, but I invested absolutely everything in bullion. So I acquired a 44-kilo portfolio, and this was in 2011 or so. And then the 2011 hit strike against silver came. Probably can all remember that. I think the price eventually fell to about a third of what it was. I think it was a peak of $48 an ounce. And so I was forced to quit my job because of ill health, so I was selling bullion month by month, and I figured that the suppression of silver price would eventually end within a few months in 2012, but it went on, and then suddenly out of the blue, BaFin announced that they were going to investigate Deutsche Bank. That was about 2013. And Deutsche Bank immediately quit their chair at the London Bullion Market Association, which was very incriminating. So I figured, well, Deutsche Bank don't really have a defense. They weren't even denying manipulation. So I sent a threatening letter to them in February of 2014, saying I wanted my bullion back and I wanted compensation on top of that. And at the time, all I wanted was something like 44 kilos of silver and 150,000 euros, which was peanuts to Deutsche Bank at the time.
So Mark, just to be clear, you held your precious metals in physical form. You had the metals, but you're fighting these guys because you lost so much because they manipulated the prices to a much lower point than where you were buying. Same thing happened to me. Same thing happened to a bunch of our listeners. Many of our listeners have been victimized. And the problem is that when you need to go and sell that metal, you're getting less than half of what you paid. So you had 44 kilos, right, of silver?
I did, yes.
Yeah.
I had that in my flat at my time. But I was forced to sell it, and they'd suppress the market. So as far as I believed, if they're going to suppress the entire market, then anyone who's forced to sell during the time of suppression has a case to claim against them. So that was my argument. They took, I think it was something like 6 months to answer. They said they'd looked into my allegations, and they found no evidence that there was manipulation going on. Case closed. I got that letter in July, and I saw in June the 19th, 2014, that they'd used Reuters to put out this story that they were auditing themselves and for gold price manipulation, and this was while they were being investigated by the German regulator BaFin. So I thought to myself, how can they tell me that they've looked into themselves and find themselves not guilty while they're telling the world that they're investigating themselves? There seems to be a contradiction there. So I put a lawsuit in the Frankfurt courts against Jürgen Fitchen, who was the CEO at the time, and I supplied my receipts for my bullion. And in Jürgen Fitchen's defense, he said one of my receipts was missing a signature. Well, he could say it was an invalid receipt and it contradicted the receipt stored at the bank, or he could have said it was an honest bank mistake, but he didn't do that. So it occurred to me that the bank might not have copies of my bullion trading receipts, and it wasn't prepared to admit that in court. So over the months, I got more convinced that when the BaFin investigation was undertaken, that they'd gone through a shredding exercise and probably destroyed all of their bullion trading receipts. And the reason they do that is that when litigation comes in from all their bullion traders, they can say, well, we've got no receipts for you, so present your own, and anyone who can't present their own can't quantify losses in a court. So this was a serious possibly a serious accountancy fraud. So I emailed BaFin, the Financial Conduct Authority, the CFTC in the USA, and the Serious Fraud Office in the UK. I presented my documents that they'd sent to me. Also, I referred to this Reuters news site. And no regulator was in the slightest bit interested that Deutsche Bank might have been rigging its audits. So I returned to the UK. The lawsuit against Fitchen didn't turn out well. His lawyer communicated in sign language to the judge. The lawyer didn't actually speak. If you can believe that. Fitchen didn't have to turn up. At the same time, he was indicted by the German authorities for fraud and potential perjury in the Koch case. So he had no credibility, yet he was allowed not to attend court. And his lawyer didn't even speak. And he wins. So this was, so I litigated again in the UK. In Germany, I was suing him for gold manipulation. In the UK, I was suing him for silver because there's slightly different profiles in the manipulation between gold and silver. In the UK, I decided I was going to go against a large number of the banks. So that was Deutsche Bank, HSBC, UBS. Should remember those three names. RBS and Barclays, so a good amount of British banks there. And in America, I was suing Citigroup and JPMorgan. If I wanted to, I could have put 20 more defendants down, but in the UK, every defendant you list in court, you have to send paperwork to them. So I've only got myself to make the paperwork, so I limited myself to these defendants. But crucially, I decided to sue Anshu Jain as director of Deutsche Bank. And all of the lawyers I contacted, as soon as they knew that I wanted to go after Jain, they suddenly lost all interest. It was as if there was this unwritten consensus that you don't touch the executives of the banks.
Well, let me jump in. One thing that we have noticed time and time again is that sometimes fines are paid by these banks, but no one from the banks ever goes to jail or is ever prosecuted for essentially their criminality. And I want to remind people that It was just 2016 that this headline appeared over on Zero Hedge in major victory for gold and silver traders, manipulation lawsuit against gold fixing banks ordered to proceed. Back in April, precious metals traders felt vindicated when Deutsche Bank agreed to settle a July 2014 lawsuit alleging precious metals manipulation by a consortium of banks. As a reminder, in July 2014, we reported that a group of silver bullion banks, including Deutsche Bank, Bank of Nova Scotia, and HSBC, later UBS was also added to the list of defendants, were accused of manipulating prices in the multi-billion-dollar precious metals market. Now, I mention that, Mark, because I want people to understand that it's little guys like you and me and most of our listeners that have been hurt by this criminality and this price fixing. And now we see silver back down at $14 or $15 an ounce. And it needs to be said that what you are doing by trying to sue these banks and get to the truth of the matter is something you're doing on behalf of all of us. Because look, your 44 kilo portfolio, correct me if I'm wrong, we're only talking about what, 1,500 ounces of silver, but you paid much higher prices for that silver than you could sell it at when you needed to sell because of this manipulation. They took it up to 50 and then they crashed it back down to below 20. And I know a lot of people out there listening are hurting because of this criminality. So I just wanted to weigh in and say that. You're right over the target. But as Kavanaugh was told by Lindsey Graham, if you've come here for justice, my friend, you've come to the wrong place at the wrong time.
It's been the lawsuit you referred to that was under Valerie E. Caproni in New York. Well, I've looked closely at that. I believe that was a setup job because Deutsche Bank, HSBC, and possibly UBS, I think they all received a bailout from the US Federal Reserve. Remember when McCain received $900,000 from Goldman Sachs and Obama received $1.8 million in donations, and both of them together bailed out AIG for several hundred billion US dollars, which was Goldman Sachs's creditor. So basically they were bribed to bail out Goldman Sachs by Goldman Sachs. Well, what's not well known throughout Europe and even in the US is that quantitative easing program ran into the trillions, and Deutsche Bank was a major recipient. So there had to be some kind of collateral in that. So I think Deutsche Bank were forced to be the fall guy for certain types of litigation. And I think when this gold and silver started to rear its head, after 2011, there was a lot of talk about manipulation, and it was obvious that litigation was coming. So I think there was a number of actions to stop the litigation. The first was that the BaFin investigation was a delaying tactic so that people would wait until the result of that investigation before commencing with litigation. But this New York lawsuit, it does not name JPMorgan or Citigroup. And they are such big investors in the silver market that if Deutsche Bank are suppressing and they are not part of the cartel, then they simply can buy on the dip and take away all of Deutsche Bank's inventory.
Well, that's right. And they benefit from the manipulation because JPMorgan has been hoarding silver, we're told, to the tune of some 800 million ounces of physical, and they're buying at historic lows. Now, just to keep this current, folks, on August 28th of this year, this headline appeared, Deutsche Bank to pay $30 million to settle case on precious metals futures manipulation. Deutsche Bank was to pay that civil penalty to settle charges that traders engaged in a scheme to manipulate the price of precious metals futures contracts, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission says. Oh, there's the CFTC coming to our rescue, Mark. They're going to make the markets fair and equitable again, aren't they? No, they're not. I don't know when this thing is going to break to the upside. I don't know when silver will ever be allowed to trade at a fair market value. But I can tell you, Mark, that it's not $14 or $15 an ounce.
It will break when industry says we can't get what we need. That's when it will break. Because a good part of the manipulation is inventory fraud, which is people pretending that they've got more of it or they can get more of it than they can. So as the population grows, as the economies develop, providing the crash doesn't a crash doesn't stop that dead, then eventually industry will turn around and say, we can't literally get a supply, we can't build solar panels, we can't produce water filters anymore. So that's what will break it. But anyway, as I was saying, this lawsuit in New York, I feel that was basically using Deutsche Bank as the fall guy. So I think the US Federal Reserve would just basically say, you've had your quantitative easing. If you don't want us to call everything in, you've more or less got to settle this lawsuit and put the blame upon yourself. And guess what? Anshu Jain, former CEO of Deutsche Bank, I think his latest job is as LIBOR man, the LIBOR czar, I think it's Cantor Fitzgerald, which is an
Yeah.
So his BaFin said he was basically number one man at Deutsche Bank for manipulating the LIBOR rates. They produced a great wad of report on him, accusing him of being the number one mafia rigger. And he just walks out of his job in Germany, and he's got a new job in the US managing LIBOR rates.
Yeah, the Cantor Fitzgerald connection is an interesting one. They were knee-deep, in my opinion, in the multi-billion dollar bond fraud that was taking place on 9/11. And I believe it was Cantor that lost, I think, just about all of their employees in one of the Twin Towers, if memory serves. Let me ask you this. Let's stick with JPMorgan for a second. You allege that Jamie Dimon bribed judges in the UK to cover up fraud at Deutsche Bank. How do you quantify that allegation? Can you quantify that allegation for us?
I think I sent you a copy of an email which was part of the original email serving of documents, and it went directly to Jamie Dimon's email address. And then JPMorgan decided they were going to defend the case. And they piggybacked onto Deutsche Bank's defense. They said in the UK lawsuit that they couldn't find a fault with Deutsche Bank's defense. And Anshu Jain of Deutsche Bank, he filed to have me have my lawsuit struck out as vexatious, which is what they tried in the New York lawsuit and failed. And I think they thought that if they forced me to attend a hearing, then I'd chicken out and burst into tears and cancel the lawsuit. Well, it turns out that they refused to turn up for their own hearing. They didn't just fail to turn up, they wrote to the court saying, we're not going to turn up for our own oral hearing. Now, at the time, I'd asked all defendants to share my bullion trading receipts because I suspected they'd been destroyed. And no defendant took up my offer, which is odd. I mean, when you sue someone for something you've bought or sold, the first thing you do is swap receipts, isn't it? And yet no defendant was worried that Deutsche Bank might be manipulating the market in which they traded. No defendant was interested in seeing the audits of Deutsche Bank. So I'd alleged a lot of judicial corruption. I've written a lot of nasty letters in the past few years. Nobody is suing me for libel. No one has given me a gagging order. I've had no policeman turn up the door saying you mustn't say this about such a judge. Anyway, at the start of this year, I thought I really do need to get these receipts just in case the bank deletes them. And says, 5 years or so have passed and we had the right to delete them. So I tried to force through a data access protection subject access request, which is very stringent in the UK and the EU now. You can force people to disclose stuff and they haven't got the legal right to object. In any case, their lawyers objected and threatened to put me in prison just for asking for my receipts. And finally, on the 5th of September this year, this is what's got me aggravated and energized. Christian Sowing, who is the new CEO of Deutsche Bank, took over from John Cryan. He was forced under EU law to disclose his receipts, and you've probably seen the copy of the letter I sent you. And he says he hasn't got a single bit of information on me. So the Deutsche Bank files are totally blank. Well, I've got a ton of information on Deutsche Bank. I've got bank statements. I've got government-mandated health insurance that nominates the old bank account as a source of funds. I've got pay slips from Crytek. You can't run a bank account for 5 years and use it as your main bank account and not create third-party records. So they've deleted a bank account, and they've deleted it before the 5-year period was up. So the question is, why the hell would they delete a bank account? Well, in the bank account, you've got bank statements, and on every month, more or less, you could see 1,800 euros disappear out of my account, labelled EDL metal, which is German, and basically it means I bought bullion directly over the counter from the bank. So every one of these entries, there should be a bullion trading receipt within the bank. So if they've shredded the receipts, then the question is how do they stop the paper trail? And I think they did that by deleting the bank account, which is a serious accountancy fraud. Now, I think what happened was that Jürgen Fitschen, when he was indicted for fraud in the Koch case, I think he was so stressed he went a bit insane. And I think after he saw that their receipts had been shredded, he probably panicked and ordered all my details to be destroyed. So when Jane gets my lawsuit and all the defendants get my lawsuit, oh my God, he's got proof that he had a bank account, but it no longer exists, which is highly incriminating of fraud. So they knew they couldn't turn up for court and get a fair judge who would ask them a simple question about the bank account without going to jail, without the executives being incriminated for shredding receipts and faking audits. So that meant that they would have to bribe every judge in advance, and they rather than work the way upwards to the Court of Appeal, they probably started at the executive, which was then Baron Thomas, the Lord Chief Justice, and now his successor, Sir Ian Burnett, who was the counsel for the defence of certain parties in the Princess Diana's inquest. So we've got a load of bent judges at the top of the judiciary. They were probably approached directly by these bankers, and they were told, whatever happens, the state of that bank account cannot be disclosed. So when Jamie Dimon and JPMorgan are filing a defence and saying we piggyback on Deutsche Bank's defence, they would have known that Deutsche Bank had faked its audits and deleted a bank account. So that incriminates Jamie Dimon directly in a cover-up.
What has the emotional toll been on you through all of this?
It's been like a living death, to be honest, because I have like software projects, and I've written screenplays, and I was interested in composing music at a serious level, but I couldn't do any of that for lack of money. So my 40s, which are meant to be, they say life begins at 40 for me. It's been like a slow death at 40, slow death of poverty. And poverty kills people. And my family are financially vulnerable. And at any time something could happen to my family, and I haven't got the finances, to make people safe in that circumstance. So it's living on the edge, living in poverty, not having one's life opportunities. When this global mafia consolidate wealth, they consolidate opportunity. You find that all of the best jobs go to the politically correct degenerates. When I was working at Crytek, I wanted a job as a script writer. And they told me they got this Microsoft script writer, and the Microsoft script writer, every line of dialogue he put into the game was a swear word. So it's just dumbing down of language. And I found time wherever I look that it's very hard to find a top job held by a good person. They don't want any chinks in the walls. But what takes the biggest toll is, as I got into this lawsuit, I began to find that there was a pattern at the top, and I now know why the bankers have been given immunity to prosecution. It's because they're all involved with elite paedophile rings.
Yeah, there you go. I was going to bring that up. You mentioned global mafia was the term you just used, and that's spot on. That's exactly what this is. And I think you are in the middle of the spider's web over in the UK, because clearly the issue with pedophilia and satanic ritual abuse and the cover-up of all of it goes to the highest levels of the royal crown. And yes. We can talk about that if you like. I mean, this audience is very well versed in what's been going on with global pedophilia.
I think we should move on to that, because the banking stuff is only interesting to people who basically do bullion investment, you know.
Well, let's talk about it then, because I know that and our audience knows that Jimmy Savile's crimes were covered up for decades.
Oh, sure.
Best friend of the prince. You know, BBC heralded him as some sort of television genius, and he was diddling kids, he was raping kids, he was murdering kids, he was a necrophiliac, knighted by the Queen.
That was actually quite minor compared to what's been disclosed as of late. I think earlier in this month, in September, the UK Parliament released a secret report by the United Nations which showed that UN workers and charity workers had been raping kids in the Congo and Haiti since 2002. So you can figure that if the United Nations has these secret reports, then the nations of the United Nations would have the reports, and all of the intelligence services. And year by year, they sat on the reports, they watched the rapes in the Congo, they ignored them, and then they watched the same teams move into Haiti and start raping the kids in Haiti. And not one intelligence service, not the FBI, not the CIA, MI5, MI6, not one of them lifted a finger to stop it. And where kids are systematically raped, kids are systematically murdered. Any kid that raises too much of a fuss would have had his throat cut. So Savile is interesting. Again, the MI5 knew about him.
Well, the MI5, MI6 was up to it with Sir Peter Heyman. His crimes were covered up. His diaries show that he was just as sick as Sir Edward Heath, your former prime minister, who's charged with having been involved in the murder of up to 16 children.
Yes, I know. And Cyril Smith and Ted Heath were both named in the Raines list, which is Joan Coleman, Dr. Joan Coleman's compendium of abuse. She was a psychiatrist. Whenever she got two children from independent backgrounds accusing the same people, she would note the name down in this list. One of the names listed was Paul Kernaghan. Now, Paul Kernaghan is named by his own police officers as having covered up a Rotherham-style child abuse ring on the Isle of Wight in the UK. But interestingly, in the last couple of months, it's been revealed that he was chief superintendent, I think it was, in 1999 of Hampshire. And in Hampshire, at that period, there was something like 1,000 deaths in the NHS in Hampshire that seemed to be deliberate. And it was known that the Hampshire police force were getting allegations of murder and then basically stonewalling. So there's the possibility that the Hampshire NHS system has been used basically to disappear people. If you were ill, they'd refer you to Hampshire, you'd be killed, and then Paul Kernaghan would cover it up. And Paul Kernaghan now with his double paedophile and murderous background, is now the head of JCO, which is the Judicial Accounts and Conduct Ombudsman in the UK, who is the judge of judges. So when a judge is alleged to be guilty of misconduct, Paul Kernaghan looks into that. And we know that from 1992 onwards to about 2016, the government and the judiciary covered up a paedophile training program called SOTP, cost 100 million quid, and year by year, the paedophiles who were trained would be released from custody having done their course, and a good percentage of them went on to abduct, rape, and murder children. And that's been covered up from 1992 onwards. And Kernaghan and Sir Ian Burnett, the Lord Chief Justice, are blocking FOIAs from the newspapers to find out how many kids were killed. And at this point, I should say that Sir Terence Etherton, who's Master of the Rolls and who was one of the key judges in the Gina Miller lawsuit to stop Brexit, he wrote something very interesting and disturbing. He said to a newspaper that the only club that Sir Ian Burnett is a member of is the Pizza Express Club.
Yeah, that
well,
sounds about right.
Yeah, well, we know what pizza means, and Etherton's married to a man. He runs the West London Reform Synagogue, but I think there's more going on at that synagogue than just Jewish prayers. It was where Sir Leon Britton had his funeral. Sir Leon Britton is known to have destroyed a dossier on paedophiles, and he was accused of being a paedophile himself, and he was investigated while he was dying of cancer. And when he dies of cancer before the investigation ends, it's the West London Synagogue that handles his funeral service. So I think there's some serious paedophile activity going on there, and I think that links into. I think when Sir Terence Etherton was talking about Pizza Express clubs, he wasn't talking about food.
No, I don't think so either. And that's how the whole investigation into Comet Ping Pong came about here in this country. The Pizzagate investigation based on the John Podesta leaked emails. Thank God Seth Rich was brave enough to do that. I know the media in this country likes to tell people it was Russia that hacked the DNC and got the emails, but it wasn't. It was Seth Rich that leaked them. And are you familiar with the testimony of former Dutch banker Ronald Bernard?
About satanic...
satanic rituals. He was invited when he was working in the highest levels of banking. He was invited at one point to go to parties, and he was invited to or urged to sacrifice a child, and he couldn't do it. And it was at that moment that his otherwise cold and frozen human heart warmed, and he wept, and he woke up. He woke up to the evils of what he was involved with, and he realized that he wanted his humanity back. So he turned his back on that life and on banking, and he's been trying to alert people and tell his story ever since.
If things were different, I might not have kind of believed that story. But in the last few years, I basically wrote a threatening letter to Barclays saying, look, there's all this... all the truth has come out about Deutsche Bank. Why don't you settle for the allegations? And the boss of Barclays, which was Jess Staley, who was a former JPMorgan employee, he wrote back and said, if you pursue this, we'll have a restraining order against you and we'll file massive costs. Well, I did a bit of background research into this Jess Staley, CEO of Barclays, and it turns out he was lobbied into position by Jeffrey Epstein, who was running paedophile rings. And the UK Treasury Select Committee, which is just a subgroup of Parliament, told the Daily Mail that they were going to grill Staley on this appointment. So they knew they knew that Epstein had threatened the UK government if it didn't make him head of Barclays. And so they said they were going to grill him. So I wrote off a fire to Parliament saying I wanted the transcript of that grilling interview. And then I got a letter back saying there was no interview, which means that the Treasury Select Committee, all of them, lied to the Daily Mail when they said they were going to grill Staley. And I wrote back to the journalist responsible for that article, and I didn't get a reply. So that suggests to me that the Daily Mail have either been threatened or they're part of this disinformation campaign. But anyway, previous to Staley's appointment was someone else called Roger Jenkins. Roger Jenkins was accused by, well, there was an allegation that there was a story by Robert Downey Jr. from Neon Nettle, and Robert Downey Jr. said allegedly said that there were sex parties involving Roger Jenkins and Diana Jenkins, Qatari citizens, and underage child prostitutes. Now, Robert Downey Jr. then went on to dismiss these allegations.
Well, and I'll just jump in. That it's highly plausible that what you just described is going on, has gone on, and will go on in the future. But Neon Nettle, I would just alert you as being a very suspect source. We've been years past. I got roped into a couple of Neon Nettle stories that I shared on SGT Report, and once burned, twice burned, no more on the third time. I don't trust Neon Nettle anymore. But I would just caution you against using Neon Nettle as a source.
Okay. One thing that was interesting was that whatever the truth of that is, Roger Jenkins was indicted by the Serious Fraud Office in the UK for lending money to the Qataris so that they could buy back Barclays shares and create fake value in Barclays shares. And his wife, Diana Jenkins, runs a charity in Haiti. How many people run honest charities for Haitian children?
Not many, like Laura Silsby, who was caught trafficking children at the border, and the Clintons came to her aid.
And if there was so much abuse going on and so much mismanagement of money, you'd expect any honest charitable do-gooder to have blown the whistle, wouldn't you? I mean, they're out there doing all this good work. They must have noticed. So I'm inclined to, it's quite possible Robert Downey Jr. had nothing to do with it. But I think whoever put that story out knew what they were talking about. They might have gilded the lily in some way, but why would Barclays, of all the people in the world, loan money to the Qataris to buy back their own shares? It makes sense to me that that would happen if the Qataris were blackmailing the Jenkins and Barclays to give them free money. And what would they have to blackmail? So there's consistency when you look outside the story with other events, which is always good for turning a tentative conspiracy theory into something, a conspiracy theory on the scientific level.
Well, Mark, let me ask you this. We've talked about a lot of stuff here, and as we sort of wrap things up, because we can't solve the world's problems, unfortunately, through a conversation. But I think conversations like these are important. And I appreciate that you're trying to carry the torch for those of us who have been victimized by these bankers and the manipulation of precious metals. What's next for you? How do you find closure on all of this? Because I don't think you're going to get the justice you seek. I hope you do. I hope on behalf of all of us that you do. But the pragmatist in me says that's probably not going to happen. So how does this all end for you?
I'm in contact with a number of people, and they all name the same names. They are all naming the same paedophile conspiracies. These people I'm in contact with, they know people in the security agencies, the police force. And the police are sick and tired of the government. They're sick and tired of the security services. There was almost a coup in 2008 in the UK under Gordon Brown. So it could be that there's some kind of police coup. And so putting this information out basically gives people the knowledge they need to fight the corruption. When someone is threatened by any of these judges, they've got the dirt on them. If they face a lawsuit, they have to stand up in court. They can point to the judge, to the jury, and then they can list the crimes of the judge to the jury. And when there's too many judges incriminated and too many people willing to expose the crimes of the judges, no judge will be functional in the UK. No court will stand, because when judges are more corrupt than the people who stand before them, the justice system will collapse. And that's what I think is going to happen. We've basically built up enough information from this destroyed bank account to blow open this conspiracy of judges. It's undeniable that judges were corrupted now. So I think it will happen, and it will happen through the courts, and it will happen with mass resignation of judges.
Well, I hope so. I mean, we're cautiously optimistic. Actually, we're very optimistic that because Donald Trump is sitting in the White House instead of the wicked witch, Hillary Clinton, we're going to see justice in this country. And we may see it in the form of military tribunals for those who have been treacherous and seditious. And that means politicians that have been traitors to our nation. There's been thousands of resignations of high-level people in corporations and otherwise here in this country too, since President Trump was sworn in. So we're very optimistic that what Q talks about is coming to fruition. And Q has said, stay tuned for a Red October, which could imply many unexpected suicides or resignations or hopefully perp walks. We shall see.
When Hillary Clinton swings from the rope, we'll know the job is done.
Well, you know what?
Yep.
You say that tongue in cheek, maybe, but maybe not. You know, it was she in a fit of rage who said, if that bastard wins, we'll all hang from nooses. So I think that they knew what was coming if she was not in the White House to stack the deck at the DOJ and the State Department and the FBI and the CIA. And she can't stack the deck. She's lost that political power. She's been politically neutered to a very, very large degree. And I thank God for that.
I think if she'd come to power, it would have been an extinction event for the human race.
I 100% agree. I don't think that's an overstatement at all. Q has said if she had won, it would have been hell on earth, and that these people are pure evil. And you're really standing against a lot of these same characters.
Well, I won't pretend it's out of pure virtue. Part of it is just surviving, you know. I need money, and I basically had a choice when they ripped me off. I could do a regular job and keep my head low and say, well, you know, let bygones be bygones and let the devil win. Or I could choose to fight, but if I chose to fight, then I'm probably never going to get a decent job again. So for me, it's a matter of survival as much as anything.
Well, how do people support you, and how do people find you out there in social media?
I don't ask for support. I did at one point, but I made a little bit of money on cryptos, so I'm just about self-sufficient. And I'd say if you've got money, then buy silver and gold for yourself, you know, and always try to fight for the truth. And fighting for the truth is fighting for your own soul.
Amen.
It's a real struggle in this life to be truthful. You first have to be truthful with yourself and face your own fears.
It's a battle of good and evil. And we've come to the conclusion many, many years ago that this is all spiritual warfare. So you're right. It is a battle for our own sanity and for our own souls. Because
there is such a thing as good and evil in this universe, although they are not things to be defined. They are phenomena out there. And the fact that they exist means there's more to this universe than just random quantum squiggles creating big bangs. There's got to be something behind the creation of humanity, that is more than just random chance?
Well, for those who would argue with you, I would suggest that they watch my most watched interview ever with my friend James Perloff, the author, and it's called "God is Real. The Elite Don't Want You to Know God is Real." And it's a very interesting conversation because James tries to quantify basically what you've just said, and we come to the conclusion that not only is God real, God is real, and the elite don't want people to know it because they want people mired down in humanism and nihilism, and they want people disconnected from the universe and the truth in the blood of Jesus Christ. And I won't proselytize here right now, but I think that it's very clear what's going on, and I appreciate you taking up the torch to try to fight these guys. Our guest has been Mark Anthony Taylor. Mark, I can't thank you enough for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. And guys, if you've enjoyed this conversation, give it a like, would you please? And make sure you stay subscribed to my YouTube channel. I keep getting emails from people saying they're being unsubbed. Just resubscribe and click the bell for notifications. And you can always find my latest videos and interviews sticky posted at the top of SGTreport.com, the corporate propaganda antidote. Thank you one and all for tuning in. We very much appreciate it. Have a wonderful week ahead. God bless. Bye-bye.
The running theme throughout my book, Hidden History, was that while the names change, the agencies certainly don't. In fact, new ones are often created and add to the mess, but it's the same kind of organized corruption.